From his earliest days, Leto Atreides was raised to be a nobleman. More than that, he was raised to be genuinely noble. Though his father, Duke Paulus, was in no ways ignorant of the political realities of an intergalactic feudal system, he ultimately raised his son to value courage, honesty, and honor above all else. In addition, the old Duke impressed very strongly upon his son the importance of understanding and caring for the people who pledged him loyalty. Caladan is primarily a rural planet, its major exports being foodstuffs, namely fish, rice, and its famous wines. As such, the young Duke-to-be had spent months of his young life living among his subjects, either helping fishermen haul in their daily catch or working the rice fields, despite the disapproval of his mother, Lady Helena. He was also trained in combat and espionage by his father's old friend and spy master, the Mentat Thufir Hawat. Then, one day at the age of 14, events were set in motion that would change the course of the young Atreides' life forever. At the old Duke's insistence, Leto was to foster for a year in the household of his father's lifelong friend and war buddy, Earl Dominic Vernius of Ix. Unsurprisingly, both Leto's mother, Lady Helena, and the Mentat Thufir Hawat were opposed. Lady Helena's opposition came from a combination of long-standing house rivalry between her own family, House Ricci's and House Vernius, and her devout piety, as she was one of many noblemen in the Landsraad convinced that the Ixian technology violated the Butlerian Jihad. Thufir's reservations were more professional, as he had a tendency to see risks and potential dangers in every dark corner. This kind of mild paranoia being an inevitable occupational hazard of being chief of security for House Atreides. Despite these objections, the old Duke had the final say in the matter and he would not be swayed. And so young Leto was packed aboard a Spacing Guild Highliner and sent off to Ix. Earl Dominic, his wife Shando, and their two children, Romber and Kylia, were warm and welcoming to the son of Duke Paulus, and all did their best to help Leto settle in, which is just as well as the young Duke-to-be spent the first few days getting over some serious culture shock. Where Caladan was a mostly rustic planet of farmers and fishermen laboring under the open sky, the population of Ix spent their entire lives in artificial cave cities beneath the planet's crust, where they spent most of their times developing and manufacturing new technologies for the rest of the Imperium. Particularly at this point in time, a new class of Highliner ship with increased cargo capacity, and new advanced combat training mechs with highly reactive programming. Earl Dominic assured Leto that these were not true thinking machines, but the line was blurred enough that the young Atreides began to wonder if maybe his mother hadn't been right all along. The one other noteworthy aspect of Ixian culture was the fact that all of the menial tasks were performed by the so-called Suboids. The best way I can sum up a Suboid is to compare them to the Epsilons from Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. They are technically humans, though the Ixians never thought of them as such, that had been bred to be low on both intelligence, imagination, and independent thinking, but high on obedience, so that they did whatever was asked of them without complaint. The Suboids were never mistreated by the Ixians, but their living standards were minimal to the point of Spartan, and actual comforts were few and far between. On the other hand, because of the Suboids' lower mental capacity, they were incapable of imagining better living standards for themselves, and so simply accepted their lot without complaint. This made it all the more ominous when one day, Leto, wishing to explore some of the lower tunnels of the capital city, stumbled upon what appeared to be a meeting of the Suboids, where one of them was urging the others to revolt against House Vernius, claiming that such technologies as the combat mechs did indeed violate the Butlerian Jihad, and that while as Suboids they weren't intelligent, they were moral and had a moral obligation to oppose such blasphemy. The Suboids suddenly discovered Leto was among them, and he barely managed to make it back to the safety of the upper levels ahead of them. Unfortunately, neither Earl Dominic nor any of his administrators took Leto's warnings seriously. They were simply too long accustomed to the Suboids' dull-minded compliance, and dismissed Leto's warnings as the exaggerations of an overwrought imagination. Unfortunately, this complacence came back to bite them quite firmly in the nethers, as a few days later, the promised Suboid revolt did in fact occur, and with their greater numbers, they overran the major cave cities within hours. Ix was a well-defended planet, but all those defenses were focused outside. The notion of an internal revolt had never occurred to them, and so they were completely blindsided by the Suboid uprising. As it turned out, Earl Dominic and his advisors hadn't been completely wrong. The Suboids had not suddenly decided to revolt of their own volition. They weren't mentally capable of that. The whole uprising had in fact been orchestrated by outsiders, the slimy and utterly despised masters of genetic manipulation, the Bene Gesserit. The Suboid that Leto had seen trying to rally the others to his cause had in fact been a Tleilaxu face dancer, a human genetically modified to be able to assume the appearance of others at will. To make matters worse, the Tleilaxu infiltrators and their Suboid puppets were later reinforced by contingents of the Sardaukar, the Padishah Emperor's personal army, all but confirming the hand of House Carino was somehow behind this uprising. I intend to reveal the events that led up to this uprising in the episode devoted to Emperor Shaddam IV, but suffice it to say, Earl Dominic and his wife realized that they were doomed. The Ixians simply could not mount a successful counterattack, and the planet would have been claimed by the enemy long before any appeal to the Landsraad could be passed through. Their only option was to separate and go into hiding. As for the children, they would be sent back to Caladan along with Leto, confident, and rightly so, that Paulus would do all in his power to ensure the children's safety. Paulus did indeed send a ship to retrieve Leto, Romber, and Kylia. Within days, Ix fell. House Vernius was declared renegade by the Emperor Elrud IX, making them fair game for anyone who wished to hunt them down and claim a reward. Fearful of the possible consequences of allying themselves with a fallen house, and convinced in her religious fanaticism that the fall of House Vernius was the righteous punishment of God, Lady Helena was vehemently opposed to sheltering Romber and Kylia at Castle Caladan. But Duke Paulus, being the stubborn, honor-bound man that he was, refused to abandon either of the two children, and did everything in his power to make their welcome at Caladan as warm as possible. At this point, Leto and Prince Romber had become good friends, and the young Duke-to-be had developed something of a crush on Kylia Vernius. However, the first few days were mostly spent by the three youngsters recovering from the stress of their ordeal and narrow escape. It was in these early days that a ragged little boy named Duncan Idaho arrived at Castle Caladan. Duncan's own backstory will have to wait for its own video, but suffice it to say, Duke Paulus took pity on the ragged urchin and offered him a job as one of the stable boys tending to the Seleucid bulls. And speaking of the bulls, a few days after Duncan's arrival, Duke Paulus decided to put on a bullfight to welcome the two Vernius siblings. Now, a Seleucid bull is about twice the size of a regular bull, has multiple pairs of horns, armored scales for its hide, the eyes of a giant horsefly, and is more vicious than 10 starving tigers. Suffice it to say, you'd have to either be insanely brave or just insane to even want to step into the ring with one. Not only had Duke Paulus been doing this for his entire adult life, he deliberately made a show of it every time, usually dragging the fight out for over an hour, spearing the bull with narcotics-laced javelins to slow it down before finally delivering the coup de grace. This time, however, things did not go as the Duke had intended. The narcotic-laced javelins seemed to further enrage the bull rather than cause it to be sleepy and slow. And just as he began to realize that something was wrong here, the bull managed to get the jump on him and impaled him through the back with its horns. In one horrific, gore-soaked spectacle, Leto Atreides became the new Duke of Caladan at the tender age of 15. Well before the old Duke's blood had dried, Thufir Hawat dedicated all of his Mentat computation abilities to finding out what had caused this. And it soon became apparent that the chosen bull for that day had been drugged, to be both hyper-aggressive and resistant to the narcotic-laced javelins. Though the castle stablemaster attempted to put the blame on Duncan, the new boy, it was painfully obvious that he was the one that had doctored the bull. However, why would he do this? Duke Paulus was universally loved by everyone on Caladan, especially his servants and staff. No, both Leto and Thufir realized that he couldn't have done this on his own volition. Someone must have put him up to it. Eventually, the painful truth came out, that it was Lady Helena herself, the Duke's own wife, that had orchestrated the killing. Lady Helena was utterly convinced that Duke Paulus was in the wrong for sheltering the two Ixians, and even more firmly believed that these actions were putting House Atreides in danger. Honestly, I'm not that surprised that she would orchestrate this murder. Given the fact that Thufir Hawat was on the case, I'm honestly more surprised that she thought she could get away with it. As it was, though Leto was unwilling to execute his own mother, even for committing murder, he did ultimately banish her to a nunnery on the far side of Caladan, as far away from him and the reins of power as it was possible to get. As Caladan mourned for the loss of its duke, news arrived from Kaitain. Emperor Elrud IX had also passed on, and, as the new duke and a member of the Landsraad, Leto was required to attend and pay his respects to Elrud's heir, Shaddam IV. Though Leto did obediently carry out his new political duty, he mostly used his first visit to the Landsraad as an opportunity to make an impassioned speech, reaffirming the friendship between House Atreides and the disgraced House Vernius, and denouncing the Tleilaxu occupation of Ix. Though some nobles were impressed by his willingness to go against the grain, after all, when the Emperor himself has declared a house to be renegade, that's kind of a big deal. The fact that he was so young meant that very few actually took him seriously. However, the scheming politics of Kaitain weren't done with the young Duke just yet. As the Atreides party began the journey back to Caladan aboard the Spacing Guild Highliner, disaster struck. The vessel sitting across the hangar from the Atreides ship was fired on, in complete defiance of Spacing Guild law. What's worse, the vessel was owned by the Bene Tleilax, and, according to all witnesses, the shots had come from the direction of the Atreides vessel. Now, no one, including Leto, had been at the firing controls, but what little evidence there was, combined with Leto's own denunciation of the Bene Tleilax, was enough to have the Grey Gnomish clone masters calling for his blood. Fortunately for the young Duke, he had angels watching over him, or in this case, witches. The Bene Gesserit had determined that he was an important part of their breeding program to produce the Kwisatz Haderach, so obviously they had no interest in letting him die just yet. Despite Leto being held in solitary confinement on Kaitain, the Sisterhood was able to slip him a message, instructing him to send his own message to the soon-to-be Emperor Shaddam, and that the message should imply that he, Leto, knew about something called Project Amal. Obviously, Leto had no idea what Project Amal was. For that matter, neither did the Sisterhood. Besides, Leto had had no prior interaction with the Sisterhood, so why should they be willing to help him? What was their ulterior motive? The Bene Gesserit were, after all, famous for their secret agendas. But ultimately, Leto knew that he was in no position to refuse their help, so he did as the letter instructed. As a result, on the day of Leto's trial, the still Crown Prince Shaddam interrupted the court proceedings to speak in defense of Leto. Admittedly, Shaddam's defense wasn't exactly very logical or legalistic. He mostly just asserted the long history of the Atreides' dedication to honor, which of course prohibited something as underhanded as firing upon a defenseless vessel, followed by an appeal to the prejudices of the judicial panel, which was comprised entirely of Landsraad noblemen. Essentially, it went something like this. Guys, these are the Bene Tleilax, the people who employ shape-shifting spies and assassins, who are sneaky and underhanded, who despise everyone else and think themselves to be God's chosen. Are you really going to side with them against one of your own? Unsurprisingly, Leto was acquitted. As a further gesture of solidarity with the young Duke, the soon-to-be Emperor gifted Leto a ceremonial dagger, and was willing to lift the death marks against both Romber and Kylia Vernius. However, he wasn't willing to do the same for their parents, who were still in hiding, nor was he about to restore Ix to them or restore House Vernius' status. And so Leto returned home, puzzling over what it was about his message to Shaddam that could have caused the soon-to-be emperor to stick his neck out so far for a distant cousin he barely knew. Obviously, it had something to do with the mysterious Project Amal, but what exactly was it? And was it connected to the Bene Tleilax in some way? And Ix? However, these were mysteries to be solved another day. In the meantime, the next 10 years passed in relative peace and quiet on Caladan. Leto grew into his role as the Duke Atreides. Duncan Idaho, desperate to serve the family that had offered him shelter in a better capacity than mere stable boy, was sent off to the planet Ginaz to become a sword master, and Romber and Kylia Vernius did their best to settle into their new roles as dispossessed aristocrats living off their friends' generosity. Prince Romber, a young man who had spent most of his years coasting along through life, quickly settled in and even took a Bene Gesserit wife named Tessia. As for Kylia, by this point she had begun to reciprocate Leto's feelings towards her. But unfortunately, in a world of aristocratic politics, marriage was something that could be made only for political or economic gain. Duke Paulus himself had told his son over and over again that love and marriage must not mix. Given the close friendship between Earl Dominic and Duke Paulus, there was a strong chance that, had things gone differently, Leto and Kylia would have become husband and wife. But with House Vernius in disgrace, Leto had to put the interests of House Atreides first, and marrying Kylia would gain his house nothing. However, for better or for worse, romance is immune to such political calculation. And eventually, after tiptoeing around each other for years, Leto and Kylia finally consummated their relationship, with Leto taking her on as his concubine. It wasn't all that long before Kylia announced that she was pregnant, and after some thorough background screening by Thufir, House Atreides hired a matronly woman named Chiara from Kaitain to serve as Kylia's midwife and personal maidservant. Both the pregnancy and the birth went off without a hitch, and soon Leto was the proud father of a bouncing baby boy named Victor. Unfortunately, it was around this time that the relationship between the young couple began to grow sour. Kylia Vernius was a young woman who had always harbored grand aspirations. More than anything else, she had wanted to be a part of life at the imperial court, and be an active player in both the power and the splendor of such things, a route that was now firmly closed to her given her family's fall from grace. Eventually, news reached Castle Caladan that her mother, Lady Shando, had been hunted down and killed by the previous Emperor's Sardaukar. A few years later, her vengeful and grief-stricken father, Earl Dominic, would attempt to take a ship full of atomics to Kaitain in an attempt to destroy the Imperial Palace and House Carino. He was ultimately betrayed, however, and only succeeded in taking with him the Sardaukar that were sent to arrest him. The future of House Vernius now lay entirely with her and her brother Romber, and as she continued to listen to more and more of Chiara's stories about her service in the Imperial Palace, the less and less accepting Kylia became of her situation as Leto's concubine, and she began to make many attempts to persuade the Duke to name Victor his official heir. Leto loved his son more than life itself, but for him, his duty to House Atreides came first, and it was far more to his advantage to remain unmarried and maintain at least the appearance of being an eligible catch for various noble houses and their daughters. It was a classic case of unstoppable force meets immovable object, and the irreparable tipping point in their relationship came when Victor was 6 years old and a group of Bene Gesserit arrived at Castle Caladan, bringing with them a message and a pretty young sister named Jessica. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and check out our website at studiobrainstorm.net. And if you have a story that you think is worth telling, we are more than happy to help you publish it. Thank you, and have a nice day.